So in this video, we're going to be covering different transform properties, and this is going to be quite a long video. Just like the transition video, we do have a lot to cover. There's many different values and functions that we need to use to complete this, but it is a pretty essential step of this section. So let's just get straight into it. So firstly, what we're going to be using in this video are actually not values, they're functions. Now, just like this RGB thing is a function that takes a bunch of inputs and gets a value out, or maybe something else. Well, it seems like this is the only one on the page, but what we're going to be doing is using a bunch of functions that take in inputs and actually physically change what this is on the page. Now, obviously, all of these do physically change what they are on the page, but instead of inputting absolute or direct values, this kind of processes in a different way behind the scenes. So let's just jump straight into it. First thing we need to learn is the property. Now, we're going to use our button again, and I'm going to be using a value called transform. So what we're going to do is plug in a bunch of different values in here and see how it affects this. So pretty much we have two different sections of this video. We have our physical change properties, or our movement, so our translation and our scaling, and then we also have our different rotation properties, or well, I should say functions, but there we go. So we're going to have our translation and our scale, so our physical changes, and then our rotation. And at the end, I'm going to throw in a nice shorthand function that summarizes all of it. So let's start with our physical changes. So the first thing we need to learn about is translate. So we're only going to be covering 2D translations for today because 3D can get very complicated very quick, and it's not really useful in day-to-day life or developer life unless you're making something that specifically needs it. So we're just going to cover 2D translations and other transformation functions for today. So pretty much what this is going to do is take in two different values. One of them is going to be the Y shift and the X shift, and it's going to actually physically shift the element to that position. So for example, if you said, I want to move this button or this image a little bit to the left, and I wanted to move, or let's just say 10 pixels to the left, and I wanted to move it 10 pixels up, it would do that. And of course, there are many different ways to do it. But what we're going to do is use this translate method to really change the way that this whole thing works. So what we're going to do is, or we're going to use an alternative method to, something like margin or grid or all of those. So the first thing you want to do is specify the x-axis value. Now, in case you haven't, learned about graphs, or you maybe forgot it, pretty much what happens is the x-axis is going to be your left and your right shift. Right is going to be your positive value, so anything above 0. And if you want to shift it left, you use negative values. And then, of course, the second value is the y-axis. So up is positive and down is negative. So let's start with our X shift. I'm going to just go ahead and say 50 pixels here. So I want to shift it 50 pixels to the right. Now remember, we don't need to say anything like to right or anything like that. We just need to specify the value. Then we throw in a comma, and here what we're going to do is add our y-axis shift. So here I'm also going to say, let's just go with 30 pixels. We'll refresh the page, see what happens. Now, we can see here that it's actually staying exactly the same. It's not moving, it's not changing anything here, but you can see that when we hover over it, it does actually move. So what's going on here? Now, here's where you have to be careful about where you add your properties. You can see that I added it to our pseudo selector instead of our base class. And that's one thing, or one point I just wanted to make about these pseudo selectors, is that if you add them on maybe here, it's not just going to inherit it magically and put it on the base class. You do need to be specific. Remember, these two are completely different classes. It's just that some of them are being overridden. So for example, our background and our padding already exist. So what happens is that all of these styles are already applied, and then the new styles here are overridden. But this is a completely new property. It doesn't actually exist on our base class. So just make sure that you don't make that mistake. Let's go ahead and paste that on the base class. I'll do it just above the transitions. Now we refresh the page and it's translated perfectly. So now that we've done that, I want to talk about browser support for a second. Now, all of these are very new features to CSS. You do need to make sure that you add your browser prefixes. So WebKit, Moz, and O. Now, I'm not going to go through and add it for all of them. I'm just going to leave it blank for now, but you need to keep in mind that if you want the maximum support on your page or on your site, you want to make sure you include those prefixes. So there we go. We've covered translate. Now let's work with our next value, which is going to be scale. So scale works in a similar way to how maybe increasing the padding would work. What's going to happen is you're going to go and you're going to type in scale, which is the name of the function. And then you're going to pass in a decimal value. It doesn't have to be a decimal, but pretty much what you're going to do is just say, let's say I want to scale this up by 2.5 times. What's going to happen is this is going to size up by 2.5. We refresh and you can see that it's gotten a lot bigger, and padding and all of that, it doesn't really apply or change anything here. It just scales everything up by 2.5. So you can obviously see some of the issues here with margin and padding and all sorts of things like this. So be pretty careful when you do this. You don't want to mess up your page or change your style or anything like that. You just want to make sure that you can scale without having to mess with the layout of your page. So that's for scale and all of the physical properties. Now let's move on to some of the rotation properties. So the first two we're going to cover, the first one I'm going to cover is pretty simple. It's just a standard rotate. But then after that, I'm going to cover two really special ones, which are actually skewing on different axes. So we'll get to that in just a second. Let's refresh the page. So the first one I'm going to use is rotate, and this takes one value. Obviously, it's going to be our degree value. So if you don't remember from our gradient section, what happens pretty much here is we rotate it kind of circularly. Well, not for this one, but we can use degrees to actually change the angle or direction of our gradient. So for example, 90 degrees would be a 90-degree shift. So it would go to the right, and then the negative 90 degrees would go the other way, so it would go to the left. So if you just remember that, you'd be doing great here. So let's just say I wanted to use minus 45 degrees, and remember the symbol for it. So what's going to happen pretty much is this is going to shift slightly, or well, not shift, but it's going to rotate, and you can see what happens there. Now, if this was minus 90, it would pretty much flip, so it was facing up vertically, and I'll actually show you that now. But pretty much what you're doing here is just rotating it around its center and changing the rotation of it. Pretty simple, pretty easy to use. So now let's talk about the two special ones. So pretty much what's going to happen here is they're going to skew them along certain axes. Now this is really hard to explain, and most likely nobody will get it if it's explained. So the only real way to show it, or the only real way to teach it, is by showing it. So what I'm going to do is use skew, and you can see we have our shorthand, and we also have skew X and skew Y. So what I'm going to select is skew X first, and pretty much this is going to shift it or rotate it along the X axis instead of its center. So remember, the X is kind of a horizontal rod. So just kind of imagine a stick or a paper attached to a rod, and you're rotating it around that rod. So now let's go ahead and input our value. Just like before, we're going to use degree values. So I'm going to go 45 degrees positive. We refresh the page, and obviously it looks quite weird because it's pretty hard to simulate these kind of things. But you can see that pretty much what this has happened is rotated along that axis. So if I go negative 45, it's going to go the other way, just like that. And you can kind of see how that works. Now, if we change this to skew Y, it's going to do this exact same thing, but it's going to be on the opposite axis. So it's going to be on a vertical rod. So just imagine that. Refresh the page, and you can see how that is working. Now, obviously, it is very hard to see and visualize, so I wouldn't encourage you to use skew X or Y. If you want to rotate something, you should most likely you should try and stick to the three I just covered. So the last value we're going to be talking about, or the last function, is going to be our matrix function. So this is going to be a shorthand to summarize everything into one go, and pretty much from here, what we're going to do is pretty much just summarize everything in one clean swoop. So pretty much this takes 6 arguments, and one thing you do have to note is it doesn't take rotation into account. It only works with skews, so you just have to keep that in mind. If you're planning to rotate it, you should probably add that as another function. So let's get started. What we're going to do is go ahead and work with our matrix function. So we're going to erase this, and we're going to go ahead and add our matrix. Now these 6 arguments do follow a very, very specific pattern or order, so we're gonna have to go through it slowly so that you can understand it. And it is a little bit out of order logically, so we're just gonna take our time with this. Now the first value is going to be your X scale. Now one thing I forgot to mention is that we were actually using shorthand functions to avoid all the mess with scale X and scale Y and just shorten things up. So one thing you do need to keep in mind is that every scale component or function like this will have an X and a Y value. And what we pretty much did is summarize them down into one or into those shorthand functions so we can just do it really easily. But here it's actually split up into different functions. So let's start with our scale X. Now, one thing to note is that if you want to keep it the same, all you have to do is input 1. Pretty much this is, oh, whoops, not typing. Pretty much what this is going to happen, or what this is going to do, is say set this button or object or element 1 times as big as itself, which is of course just going to result in the same. So the next is your skew Y and your skew X. Now if you don't want to do anything, you set it to 0, but if you do want to skew it along the axes, you do have to use decimal values here. And one thing also to note is that you don't have to include the units like we did before, so no px or mm or deg or deg or anything like that. You just include the numbers. So you do include decimal points here. So I'm just going to go 0.45 on both of these. And remember, this is actually 45 degrees, so keep that in mind. Next thing we're going to do is input our scale Y. So again, you do have scale X and scale Y. If you want to keep it the same, set it to 1. And then you have your translate X and translate Y. So I'm going to say 100 pixels, 150. Remember, pixels, pixels. So this is a little bit confusing, but don't try not to use it that much. Only use it if you really have to, or if you want to shorten code down. But I would recommend not using this function very often. It's quite clunky and ordered, and it doesn't really allow for freedom. So just keep that in mind when you're using it. Let's refresh, and you can see our new item here. Scaling is of course the same. It's shifted on the X and Y axes, so you can see that here. It doesn't create that rotation that you may be expecting because remember, it is a skew on individual axes. Just remember that. And of course, our scale on the X and Y is 1. Our translation of X is 100, so it's about this much. And then our translation of Y is 50. So there we go. We have everything set up, and now it's pretty much just all working. We have our shifts, our movements here, and we also have our scaling. So go ahead and try these out on different elements. It doesn't just have to be with a button. You can use this on grid elements, although some of them may not work. You can use this on images, text, all sorts of things. These work on any element, and they can really help you to style your website without having to use some of the traditional methods that we've learned. All right, let's move on.